Chapter 22 of The Bride of Lammermoor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 22. And soon they spied the merry men green, and eke the coach and four, Duke upon Duke. Craigengelt set forth on his mission so soon as his equipage was complete, prosecuted his journey with all diligence, and accomplished his commission with all the dexterity for which Bucklaw had given him credit. As he arrived with credentials from Mr. Haston of Bucklaw, he was extremely welcome to both ladies, and those who are prejudiced in favour of a new acquaintance can, for a time at least, discover excellencies in his very faults, and perfections in his deficiencies. Although both ladies were accustomed to good society, yet, being predetermined to find out an agreeable and well-behaved gentleman in Mr. Haston's friend, they succeeded wonderfully in imposing on themselves. It is true that Craigengelt was now handsomely dressed, and that was a point of no small consequence. But independent of outward show, his blackguard impudence of address was construed into honourable bluntness, becoming his supposed military profession. His hectoring passed for courage, and his sauciness for wit. Lest, however, any one should think this a violation of probability, we must add, in fairness to the two ladies, that their discernment was greatly blinded, and their favour propitiated, by the opportune arrival of Captain Craigengelt in the moment when they were longing for a third hand to make a party at Tidril, in which, as in all games, whether of chance or skill, that worthy person was a great proficient. When he found himself established in favour, his next point was how best to use it for the furtherance of his patron's views. He found Lady Ashton prepossessed strongly in favour of the motion which Lady Blenkinsop, partly from regard to her kinswoman, partly from the spirit of matchmaking, had not hesitated to propose to her, so that his task was an easy one. Bucklaw, reformed from his prodigality, was just the sort of husband which she desired to have for her shepherdess of Lammermoor; and while the marriage gave her an easy fortune and a respectable country gentleman for her husband, Lady Ashton was of opinion that her destinies would be fully and most favourably accomplished. It so chanced also that Bucklaw, among his new acquisitions, had gained the management of a little political interest in a neighbouring county, where the Douglas family originally held large possessions. It was one of the bosom hopes of Lady Ashton that her eldest son, Sholto, should represent this county in the British Parliament, and she saw this alliance with Bucklaw as a circumstance which might be highly favourable to her wishes. Craigengelt, who, in his way, by no means wanted sagacity, no sooner discovered in what quarter the wind of Lady Ashton's wishes sat, than he trimmed his course accordingly. There was little to prevent Bucklaw himself from sitting for the county. He must carry the heat, must walk the course. 2 cousins germain, 6 more distant kinsmen, his factor, and his chamberlain, were all hollow votes, and the Girnington interest had always carried, betwixt love and fear, about as many more. But Bucklaw cared no more about riding the first horse, and that sort of thing, than he, Craigengelt, did about a game at Birkie. It was a pity his interest was not in good guidance. All this Lady Ashton drank in with willing and attentive ears, resolving internally to be herself the person who should take the management of the political influence of her destined son-in-law, for the benefit of her eldest born, Sholto, and all other parties concerned. When he found her ladyship thus favourably disposed, the captain proceeded, to use his employer's phrase, to set spurs to her resolution, by hinting at the situation of matters at Ravenswood Castle, the long residence which the heir of that family had made with the Lord Keeper, and the reports which, though he would be damned ere he gave credit to any of them, had been idly circulated in the neighbourhood. It was not the captain's cue to appear himself to be uneasy on the subject of these rumours, but he easily saw from Lady Ashton's flushed cheek, hesitating voice, and flashing eye, that she had caught the alarm which he intended to communicate. She had not heard from her husband so often or so regularly as she thought him bound in duty to have written, and of this very interesting intelligence concerning his visit to the Tower of Wolf's Crag, and the guest whom, with such cordiality, he had received at Ravenswood Castle, he had suffered his lady to remain altogether ignorant, until she now learned it by the chance information of a stranger. Such concealment approached in her apprehension to a misprision, at last, of treason, if not to actual rebellion against her matrimonial authority, and in her inward soul she did vow to take vengeance on the Lord Keeper, as on a subject detected in meditating revolt. Her indignation burned the more fiercely as she found herself obliged to suppress it in presence of Lady Blenkinsop the kinswoman, and of Craigengelt the confidential friend of Bucklaw, of whose alliance she now became trebly desirous, since it occurred to her alarmed imagination that her husband might, in his policy or timidity, prefer that of Ravenswood. The captain was engineer enough to discover that the train was fired, and therefore heard in the course of the same day, without the least surprise, that Lady Ashton had resolved to abridge her visit to Lady Blenkinsop, and set forth with the peep of morning on her return to Scotland, using all the dispatch which the state of the roads and the mode of travelling would possibly permit. Unhappy Lord Keeper! Little was he aware what a storm was travelling towards him in all the speed with which an old-fashioned coach and six could possibly achieve its journey. He, like Don Gaiferos, forgot his lady fair and true, and was only anxious about the expected visit of the Marquis of A. Soothfast tidings had assured him that this nobleman was at length, and without fail, to honour his castle at 1 in the afternoon, being a late dinner hour, and much was the bustle in consequence of the annunciation. The Lord Keeper traversed the chambers, held consultation with the butler in the cellars, and even ventured, at the risk of a démêlé, with a cook of a spirit lofty enough to scorn the admonitions of Lady Ashton herself, to peep into the kitchen. Satisfied at length that everything was in as active a train of preparation as was possible, he summoned Ravenswood and his daughter to walk upon the terrace, for the purpose of watching from that commanding position the earliest symptoms of his lordship's approach. For this purpose, with slow and idle step, he paraded the terrace, which, flanked with a heavy stone battlement, stretched in front of the castle upon a level with the first story, while visitors found access to the court by a projecting gateway, the bartizan, or flat-leaded roof of which was accessible from the terrace by an easy flight of low and broad steps. The whole bore a resemblance partly to a castle, partly to a nobleman's seat, and, though calculated in some respects for defence, evinced that it had been constructed under a sense of the power and security of the ancient lords of Ravenswood. This pleasant walk commanded a beautiful and extensive view, but what was most to our present purpose, there were seen from the terrace 2 roads, one leading from the east and one from the westward, which, crossing a ridge opposed to the eminence on which the castle stood, at different angles, gradually approached each other, until they joined not far from the gate of the avenue. It was to the westward approach that the Lord Keeper, from a sort of fidgeting anxiety, his daughter from complaisance to him, and Ravenswood, though feeling some symptoms of internal impatience, out of complaisance to his daughter, directed their eyes to see the precursors of the Marquis's approach. These were not long of presenting themselves. 2 running footmen, dressed in white, with black jockey caps and long staffs in their hands, headed the train, and such was their agility that they found no difficulty in keeping the necessary advance, which the etiquette of their station required, before the carriage and horsemen. Onward they came at a long swinging trot, arguing unwearied speed in their long-breathed calling. Such running footmen are often alluded to in old plays. I would particularly instance Middleton's Mad World, my masters, and perhaps may be still remembered by some old persons in Scotland as part of the retinue of the ancient nobility when travelling in full ceremony. Behind these glancing meteors, who footed it as if the Avenger of Blood had been behind them, came a cloud of dust, raised by riders who proceeded, attended or followed the state carriage of the Marquis. The privilege of nobility in those days had something in it impressive on the imagination. The dresses and liveries and number of their attendants, their style of travelling, the imposing and almost warlike air of the armed men who surrounded them, placed them far above the laird who travelled with his brace of footmen. And as to rivalry from the mercantile part of the community, these would as soon have thought of imitating the state equipage of the sovereign. At present it is different, and I myself, Peter Pattieson, in a late journey to Edinburgh, had the honour, in the mail coach phrase, to change a leg with a peer of the realm. It was not so in the days of which I write, and the Marquis's approach, so long expected in vain, now took place in the full pomp of ancient aristocracy. Sir William Ashton was so much interested in what he beheld, and in considering the ceremonial of reception, in case any circumstance had been omitted, that he scarce heard his son Henry exclaim, "There's another coach and six coming down the east road, papa. Can they both belong to the Marquis of A?" At length, when the youngster had fairly compelled his attention by pulling his sleeve, he turned his eyes, and as he turned, surveyed an awful vision. Sure enough, another coach and six, with 4 servants or outriders in attendance, was descending the hill from the eastward, at such a pace as made it doubtful which of the carriages thus approaching them from different quarters would first reach the gate at the extremity of the avenue. The one coach was green, the other blue, and not the green and blue chariots in the circus of Rome or Constantinople excited more turmoil among the citizens than the double apparition occasioned in the mind of the Lord Keeper. We all remember the terrible exclamation of the dying profligate, when a friend, to destroy what he supposed the hypochondriac idea of a spectre appearing in a certain shape at a given hour, placed before him a person dressed up in the manner he described. "Mon Dieu!" said the expiring sinner, who, it seems, saw both the real and polygraphic apparition, "Il y en a deux." The surprise of the Lord Keeper was scarcely less unpleasing at the duplication of the expected arrival. His mind misgave him strangely. There was no neighbour who would have approached so unceremoniously at a time when ceremony was held in such respect. It must be Lady Ashton, said his conscience, and followed up the hint with an anxious anticipation of the purpose of her sudden and unannounced return. He felt that he was caught in the manner, that the company in which she had so unluckily surprised him was likely to be highly distasteful to her, there was no question, and the only hope which remained for him was her high sense of dignified propriety, which he trusted might prevent a public explosion. But so active were his doubts and fears as altogether to derange his proposed ceremonial for the reception of the Marquis. These feelings of apprehension were not confined to Sir William Ashton. "It is my mother! It is my mother!" said Lucy, turning as pale as ashes, and clasping her hands together as she looked at Ravenswood. "And if it be Lady Ashton," said her lover to her in a low tone, "what can be the occasion of such alarm? Surely the return of a lady to the family from which she has been so long absent should excite other sensations than those of fear and dismay." "You do not know my mother," said Miss Ashton, in a tone almost breathless with terror. "What will she say when she sees you in this place?" "My stay has been too long," said Ravenswood, somewhat haughtily, "if her displeasure at my presence is likely to be so formidable. My dear Lucy," he resumed, in a tone of soothing encouragement, "you are too childishly afraid of Lady Ashton. She is a woman of family, a lady of fashion, a person who must know the world, and what is due to her husband and her husband's guests." Lucy shook her head, and, as if her mother, still at the distance of half a mile, could have seen and scrutinized her deportment, she withdrew herself from beside Ravenswood, and taking her brother Henry's arm, led him to a different part of the terrace. The keeper also shuffled down towards the portal of the great gate, without inviting Ravenswood to accompany him, and thus he remained standing alone on the terrace, deserted and shunned, as it were, by the inhabitants of the mansion. This suited not the mood of one who was proud in proportion to his poverty, and who thought that, in sacrificing his deep-rooted resentments so far as to become Sir William Ashton's guest, he conferred a favour, and received none. "I can forgive Lucy," he said to himself. "She is young, timid, and conscious of an important engagement assumed without her mother's sanction. Yet she should remember with whom it has been assumed, and leave me no reason to suspect that she is ashamed of her choice. For the keeper, sense, spirit, and expression seem to have left his face and manner since he had the first glimpse of Lady Ashton's carriage. I must watch how this is to end, and if they give me reason to think myself an unwelcome guest, my visit is soon abridged." With these suspicions floating on his mind, he left the terrace, and walking towards the stables of the castle, gave directions that his horse should be kept in readiness, in case he should have occasion to ride abroad. In the meanwhile, the drivers of the two carriages, the approach of which had occasioned so much dismay at the castle, had become aware of each other's presence, as they approached upon different lines to the head of the avenue as a common centre. Lady Ashton's driver and postilions instantly received orders to get foremost, if possible, her ladyship being desirous of dispatching her first interview with her husband before the arrival of these guests, whoever they might happen to be. On the other hand, the coachman of the Marquis, conscious of his own dignity and that of his master, and observing the rival charioteer was mending his pace, resolved, like a true brother of the whip, whether ancient or modern, to vindicate his right of precedence; so that, to increase the confusion of the Lord Keeper's understanding, he saw the short time which remained for consideration abridged by the haste of the contending coachmen, who, fixing their eyes sternly on each other, and applying the lash smartly to their horses, began to thunder down the descent with emulous rapidity, while the horsemen who attended them were forced to put on to a hand gallop. Sir William's only chance now remaining was the possibility of an overturn, and that his lady or visitor might break their necks. I am not aware that he formed any distinct wish on the subject, but I have no reason to think that his grief in either case would have been altogether inconsolable. This chance, however, also disappeared, for Lady Ashton, though insensible to fear, began to see the ridicule of running a race with a visitor of distinction, the goal being the portal of her own castle, and commanded her coachman, as they approached the avenue, to slacken his pace, and allow precedence to the stranger's equipage, a command which he gladly obeyed, as coming in time to save his honour, the horses of the Marquis's carriage being better, or at least fresher, than his own. He restrained his pace, therefore, and suffered the green coach to enter the avenue with all its retinue, which pass it occupied with the speed of a whirlwind. The Marquis's laced charioteer no sooner found the pas d'avance was granted to him than he resumed a more deliberate pace, at which he advanced under the embowering shade of the lofty elms, surrounded by all the attendants, while the carriage of Lady Ashton followed, still more slowly, at some distance. In the front of the castle, and beneath the portal which admitted guests into the inner court, stood Sir William Ashton, much perplexed in mind, his younger son and daughter beside him, and in their rear a train of attendants of various ranks, in and out of livery. The nobility and gentry of Scotland at this period were remarkable even to extravagance for the number of their servants, whose services were easily purchased in a country where men were numerous beyond proportion to the means of employing them. The manners of a man trained like Sir William Ashton are too much at his command to remain long disconcerted with the most adverse concurrence of circumstances. He received the Marquis, as he alighted from his equipage, with the usual compliments of welcome, and as he ushered him into the great hall, expressed his hope that his journey had been pleasant. The Marquis was a tall, well-made man, with a thoughtful and intelligent countenance, and an eye in which the fire of ambition had for some years replaced the vivacity of youth, a bold, proud expression of countenance, yet chastened by habitual caution, and the desire which, as the head of a party, he necessarily entertained of acquiring popularity. He answered with courtesy the courteous inquiries of the Lord Keeper, and was formally presented to Miss Ashton, in the course of which ceremony the Lord Keeper gave the first symptom of what was chiefly occupying his mind, by introducing his daughter as his wife, Lady Ashton. Lucy blushed. The Marquis looked surprised at the extremely juvenile appearance of his hostess, and the Lord Keeper with difficulty rallied himself so far as to explain. "I should have said my daughter, my lord, but the truth is that I saw Lady Ashton's carriage enter the avenue shortly after your lordship's, and—" "Make no apology, my lord," replied his noble guest. "Let me entreat you will wait on your lady, and leave me to cultivate Miss Ashton's acquaintance. I am shocked my people should have taken precedence of our hostess at her own gate. But your lordship is aware that I supposed Lady Ashton was still in the south. Permit me to beseech you will waive ceremony, and hasten to welcome her." This was precisely what the Lord Keeper longed to do, and he instantly profited by his lordship's obliging permission. To see Lady Ashton, and encounter the first burst of her displeasure in private, might prepare her in some degree to receive her unwelcome guests with due decorum. As her carriage therefore stopped, the arm of the attentive husband was ready to assist Lady Ashton in dismounting. Looking as if she saw him not, she put his arm aside, and requested that of Captain Craigengelt, who stood by the coach with his laced hat under his arm, having acted as cavalier servant, or squire in attendance, during the journey. Taking hold of this respectable person's arm as if to support her, Lady Ashton traversed the court, uttering a word or two by way of direction to the servants, but not one to Sir William, who in vain endeavoured to attract her attention, as he rather followed than accompanied her into the hall, in which they found the Marquis in close conversation with the Master of Ravenswood. Lucy had taken the first opportunity of escaping. There was embarrassment on every countenance except that of the Marquis of A, for even Craigengelt's impudence was hardly able to veil his fear of Ravenswood, and the rest felt the awkwardness of the position in which they were thus unexpectedly placed. After waiting a moment to be presented by Sir William Ashton, the Marquis resolved to introduce himself. "The Lord Keeper," he said, bowing to Lady Ashton, "has just introduced to me his daughter as his wife. He might very easily present Lady Ashton as his daughter, so little does she differ from what I remember her some years since. Will she permit an old acquaintance the privilege of a guest?" He saluted the lady with too good a grace to apprehend a repulse, and then proceeded: "This, Lady Ashton, is a peace-making visit, and therefore I presume to introduce my cousin, the young Master of Ravenswood, to your favourable notice." Lady Ashton could not choose but curtsy, but there was in her obeisance an air of haughtiness approaching to contemptuous repulse. Ravenswood could not choose but bow, but his manner returned the scorn with which he had been greeted. "Allow me," she said, "to present to your lordship my friend." Craigengelt, with the forward impudence which men of his caste mistake for ease, made a sliding bow to the Marquis, which he graced by a flourish of his gold-laced hat. The lady turned to her husband. "You and I, Sir William," she said, and these were the first words she had addressed to him, "have acquired new acquaintances since we parted. Let me introduce the acquisition I have made to mine, Captain Craigengelt." Another bow, and another flourish of the gold-laced hat, which was returned by the Lord Keeper without intimation of former recognition, and with that sort of anxious readiness which intimated his wish that peace and amnesty should take place betwixt the contending parties, including the auxiliaries on both sides. "Let me introduce you to the Master of Ravenswood," said he to Captain Craigengelt, following up the same amicable system. But the Master drew up his tall form to the full extent of his height, and without so much as looking towards the person thus introduced to him, he said in a marked tone, "Captain Craigengelt and I are already perfectly well acquainted with each other." "Perfectly, perfectly," replied the captain in a mumbling tone, like that of a double echo, and with a flourish of his hat, the circumference of which was greatly abridged, compared with those which had so cordially graced his introduction to the Marquis and the Lord Keeper. Lockhard, followed by 3 menials, now entered with wine and refreshments, which it was the fashion to offer as a whet before dinner; and when they were placed before the guests, Lady Ashton made an apology for withdrawing her husband from them for some minutes upon business of special import. The Marquis, of course, requested her ladyship would lay herself under no restraint, and Craigengelt, bolting with speed a second glass of racy canary, hastened to leave the room, feeling no great pleasure in the prospect of being left alone with the Marquis of A and the Master of Ravenswood, the presence of the former holding him in awe, and that of the latter in bodily terror. Some arrangements about his horse and baggage formed the pretext for his sudden retreat, in which he persevered, although Lady Ashton gave Lockhard orders to be careful most particularly to accommodate Captain Craigengelt with all the attendance which he could possibly require. The Marquis and the Master of Ravenswood were thus left to communicate to each other their remarks upon the reception which they had met with, while Lady Ashton led the way, and her lord followed somewhat like a condemned criminal to her ladyship's dressing-room. So soon as the spouses had both entered, her ladyship gave way to that fierce audacity of temper which she had with difficulty suppressed out of respect to appearances. She shut the door behind the alarmed Lord Keeper, took the key out of the spring lock, and with a countenance which years had not bereft of its haughty charms, and eyes which spoke at once resolution and resentment, she addressed her astounded husband in these words: "My lord, I am not greatly surprised at the connections you have been pleased to form during my absence. They are entirely in conformity with your birth and breeding, and if I did expect anything else, I heartily own my error, and that I merit by having done so the disappointment you had prepared for me." "My dear Lady Ashton, my dear Eleanor," said the Lord Keeper, "listen to reason for a moment, and I will convince you I have acted with all the regard due to the dignity as well as the interest of my family." "To the interest of your family I conceive you perfectly capable of attending," returned the indignant lady, "and even to the dignity of your own family also, as far as it requires any looking after. But as mine happens to be inextricably involved with it, you will excuse me if I choose to give my own attention so far as that is concerned." "What would you have, Lady Ashton?" said the husband. "What is it that displeases you? Why is it that, on your return after so long an absence, I am arraigned in this manner?" "Ask your own conscience, Sir William, what has prompted you to become a renegade to your political party and opinions, and led you, for what I know, to be on the point of marrying your only daughter to a beggarly Jacobite bankrupt, the inveterate enemy of your family to the boot?" "Why, what, in the name of common sense and common civility, would you have me do, madam?" answered her husband. "Is it possible for me, with ordinary decency, to turn a young gentleman out of my house who saved my daughter's life and my own but the other morning, as it were?" "Saved your life! I have heard of that story," said the lady. "The Lord Keeper was scared by a dun cow, and he takes the young fellow who killed her for Guy of Warwick. Any butcher from Haddington may soon have an equal claim on your hospitality." "Lady Ashton," stammered the keeper, "this is intolerable; and when I am desirous, too, to make you easy by any sacrifice, if you would but tell me what you would be at." "Go down to your guests," said the imperious dame, "and make your apology to Ravenswood, that the arrival of Captain Craigengelt and some other friends renders it impossible for you to offer him lodgings at the castle. I expect young Mr. Hayston of Bucklaw." "Good heavens, madam!" ejaculated her husband. "Ravenswood to give place to Craigengelt, a common gambler and an informer! It was all I could do to forbear desiring the fellow to get out of my house, and I was much surprised to see him in your ladyship's train." "Since you saw him there, you might be well assured," answered this meek helpmate, "that he was proper society. As to this Ravenswood, he only meets with the treatment which, to my certain knowledge, he gave to a much valued friend of mine, who had the misfortune to be his guest some time since. But take your resolution, for if Ravenswood does not quit the house, I will." Sir William Ashton paced up and down the apartment in the most distressing agitation, fear and shame and anger contending against the habitual deference he was in the use of rendering to his lady. At length it ended, as is usual with timid minds placed in such circumstances, in his adopting a mezzo termine, a middle measure. "I tell you frankly, madam, I neither can nor will be guilty of the incivility you propose to the Master of Ravenswood. He has not deserved it at my hand. If you will be so unreasonable as to insult a man of quality under your own roof, I cannot prevent you, but I will not at least be the agent in such a preposterous proceeding." "You will not?" asked the lady. "No, by heavens, madam," her husband replied. "Ask me anything congruent with common decency, as to drop his acquaintance by degrees or the like, but to bid him leave my house is what I will not and cannot consent to." "Then the task of supporting the honour of the family will fall on me, as it has often done before," said the lady. She sat down and hastily wrote a few lines. The Lord Keeper made another effort to prevent her taking a step so decisive, just as she opened the door to call her female attendant from the anteroom. "Think what you are doing, Lady Ashton. You are making a mortal enemy of a young man who is like to have the means of harming us." "Did you ever know a Douglas who feared an enemy?" answered the lady contemptuously. "Ay, but he is as proud and vindictive as 100 Douglases, and 100 devils to boot. Think of it for a night only." "Not for another moment," answered the lady. "Here, Mrs. Patullo, give this billet to young Ravenswood." "To the master, madam?" said Mrs. Patullo. "Ay, to the master, if you call him so." "I wash my hands of it entirely," said the keeper, "and I shall go down into the garden, and see that Jardine gathers the winter fruit for the dessert." "Do so," said the lady, looking after him with glances of infinite contempt, "and thank God that you leave one behind you as fit to protect the honour of the family as you are to look after pippins and pears." The Lord Keeper remained long enough in the garden to give her ladyship's mind time to explode, and to let, as he thought, at least the first violence of Ravenswood's displeasure blow over. When he entered the hall, he found the Marquis of A giving orders to some of his attendants. He seemed in high displeasure, and interrupted an apology which Sir William had commenced for having left his lordship alone. "I presume, Sir William, you are no stranger to this singular billet with which my kinsman of Ravenswood," an emphasis on the word my, "has been favoured by your lady, and of course that you are prepared to receive my adieu. My kinsman is already gone, having thought it unnecessary to offer any on his part, since all former civilities had been cancelled by this singular insult." "I protest, my lord," said Sir William, holding the billet in his hand, "I am not privy to the contents of this letter. I know Lady Ashton is a warm-tempered and prejudiced woman, and I am sincerely sorry for any offence that has been given or taken; but I hope your lordship will consider that a lady should bear herself towards persons of a certain rank with the breeding of one," said the Marquis, completing the half-uttered sentence. "True, my lord," said the unfortunate keeper, "but Lady Ashton is still a woman." "And as such, methinks," said the Marquis, again interrupting him, "should be taught the duties which correspond to her station. But here she comes, and I will learn from her own mouth the reason for this extraordinary and unexpected affront offered to my near relation, while both he and I were her ladyship's guests." Lady Ashton accordingly entered the apartment at this moment. Her dispute with Sir William, and a subsequent interview with her daughter, had not prevented her from attending to the duties of her toilet. She appeared in full dress, and from the character of her countenance and manner well became the splendour with which ladies of quality then appeared on such occasions. The Marquis of A bowed haughtily, and she returned the salute with equal pride and distance of demeanour. He then took from the passive hand of Sir William Ashton the billet he had given him the moment before. He approached the lady, and was about to speak, when she interrupted him. "I perceive, my lord, you are about to enter upon an unpleasant subject. I am sorry any such should have occurred at this time, to interrupt in the slightest degree the respectful reception due to your lordship. But so it is. Mr. Edgar Ravenswood, for whom I have addressed the billet in your lordship's hand, has abused the hospitality of this family, and Sir William Ashton's softness of temper, in order to seduce a young person into engagements without her parents' consent, and of which they can never approve." Both gentlemen answered at once. "My kinsman is incapable," said the Lord Marquis. "I am confident that my daughter Lucy is still more incapable," said the Lord Keeper. Lady Ashton at once interrupted and replied to them both. "My Lord Marquis, your kinsman, if Mr. Ravenswood has the honour to be so, has made the attempt privately to secure the affections of this young and inexperienced girl. Sir William Ashton, your daughter has been simple enough to give more encouragement than she ought to have done to so very improper a suitor." "And I think, madam," said the Lord Keeper, losing his accustomed temper and patience, "that if you had nothing better to tell us, you had better have kept this family secret to yourself also." "You will pardon me, Sir William," said the lady calmly. "The noble Marquis has a right to know the cause of the treatment I have found it necessary to use to a gentleman whom he calls his blood relation." "It is a cause," muttered the Lord Keeper, "which has emerged since the effect has taken place, for if it exists at all, I am sure she knew nothing of it when her letter to Ravenswood was written." "It is the first time that I have heard of this," said the Marquis; "but since your ladyship has tabled a subject so delicate, permit me to say that my kinsman's birth and connections entitled him to a patient hearing, and at least a civil refusal, even in case of his being so ambitious as to raise his eyes to the daughter of Sir William Ashton." "You will recollect, my lord, of what blood Miss Lucy Ashton is come by the mother's side," said the lady. "I do remember your descent from a younger branch of the house of Angus," said the Marquis, "and your ladyship, forgive me, lady, ought not to forget that the Ravenswoods have thrice intermarried with the main stem. Come, madam, I know how matters stand. Old and long fostered prejudices are difficult to get over. I make every allowance for them. I ought not, and I would not, otherwise have suffered my kinsman to depart alone, expelled, in a manner, from this house, but I had hopes of being a mediator. I am still unwilling to leave you in anger, and shall not set forward till after noon, as I rejoin the Master of Ravenswood upon the road a few miles from hence. Let us talk over this matter more coolly." "It is what I anxiously desire, my lord," said Sir William Ashton eagerly. "Lady Ashton, you will not permit my Lord of A to leave us in displeasure. We must compel him to tarry dinner at the castle." "The castle," said the lady, "and all that it contains are at the command of the Marquis, so long as he chooses to honour it with his residence. But touching the farther discussion of this disagreeable topic—" "Pardon me, good madam," said the Marquis, "but I cannot allow you to express any hasty resolution on a subject so important. I see that more company is arriving, and since I have the good fortune to renew my former acquaintance with Lady Ashton, I hope she will give me leave to avoid perilling what I prize so highly upon any disagreeable subject of discussion, at least till we have talked over more pleasant topics." The lady smiled, curtsied, and gave her hand to the Marquis, by whom, with all the formal gallantry of the time, which did not permit the guest to tuck the lady of the house under the arm, as a rustic does his sweetheart at a wake, she was ushered to the eating-room. Here they were joined by Bucklaw, Craigengelt, and other neighbours, whom the Lord Keeper had previously invited to meet the Marquis of A. An apology, founded upon a slight indisposition, was alleged as an excuse for the absence of Miss Ashton, whose seat appeared unoccupied. The entertainment was splendid to profusion, and was protracted till a late hour. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Bride of Lammermoor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 23. Such was our fallen father's fate, yet better than mine own. He shared his exile with his mate, I'm banished forth alone. Waller. I will not attempt to describe the mixture of indignation and regret with which Ravenswood left the seat which had belonged to his ancestors. The terms in which Lady Ashton's billet was couched rendered it impossible for him, without being deficient in that spirit of which he perhaps had too much, to remain an instant longer within its walls. The Marquis, who had his share in the affront, was nevertheless still willing to make some efforts at conciliation. He therefore suffered his kinsman to depart alone, making him promise, however, that he would wait for him at the small inn called the Tod's Hole, situated, as our readers may be pleased to recollect, half-way betwixt Ravenswood Castle and Wolf's Crag, and about 5 Scottish miles distant from each. Here the Marquis proposed to join the Master of Ravenswood, either that night or the next morning. His own feelings would have induced him to have left the castle directly, but he was loath to forfeit, without at least one effort, the advantages which he had proposed from his visit to the Lord Keeper. And the Master of Ravenswood was, even in the very heat of his resentment, unwilling to foreclose any chance of reconciliation which might arise out of the partiality which Sir William Ashton had shown towards him, as well as the intercessory arguments of his noble kinsman. He himself departed without a moment's delay, farther than was necessary to make this arrangement. At first he spurred his horse at a quick pace through an avenue of the park, as if, by rapidity of motion, he could stupefy the confusion of feelings with which he was assailed. But as the road grew wilder and more sequestered, and when the trees had hidden the turrets of the castle, he gradually slackened his pace, as if to indulge the painful reflections which he had in vain endeavoured to repress. The path in which he found himself led him to the Mermaiden's Fountain, and to the cottage of Alice, and the fatal influence which superstitious belief attached to the former spot, as well as the admonitions which had been in vain offered to him by the inhabitant of the latter, forced themselves upon his memory. "Old saws speak truth," he said to himself, "and the Mermaiden's Well has indeed witnessed the last act of rashness of the heir of Ravenswood. Alice spoke well," he continued, "and I am in the situation which she foretold, or rather, I am more deeply dishonoured, not the dependent and ally of the destroyer of my father's house, as the old Sibyl presaged, but the degraded wretch who has aspired to hold that subordinate character, and has been rejected with disdain. We are bound to tell the tale as we have received it, and considering the distance of the time and propensity of those through whose mouths it has passed to the marvellous, this could not be called a Scottish story, unless it manifested a tinge of Scottish superstition. As Ravenswood approached the solitary fountain, he is said to have met with the following singular adventure. His horse, which was moving slowly forward, suddenly interrupted its steady and composed pace, snorted, reared, and, though urged by the spur, refused to proceed, as if some object of terror had suddenly presented itself. On looking to the fountain, Ravenswood discerned a female figure, dressed in a white or rather greyish mantle, placed on the very spot on which Lucy Ashton had reclined while listening to the fatal tale of love. His immediate impression was that she had conjectured by which path he would traverse the path on his departure, and placed herself at this well-known and sequestered place of rendezvous, to indulge her own sorrow and his parting interview. In this belief he jumped down from his horse, and making its bridle fast to a tree, walked hastily towards the fountain, pronouncing eagerly, yet under his breath, the words, "Miss Ashton! Lucy!" The figure turned as he addressed it, and displayed to his wondering eyes the features not of Lucy Ashton, but of old blind Alice. The singularity of her dress, which rather resembled a shroud than the garment of a living woman, the appearance of her person, larger, as it struck him, than it usually seemed to be. Above all, the strange circumstance of a blind, infirm, and decrepit person being found alone and at a distance from her habitation, considerable if her infirmities be taken into account, combined to impress him with a feeling of wonder approaching to fear. As he approached, she arose slowly from her seat, held her shrivelled hand up as if to prevent his coming more near, and her withered lips moved fast, although no sound issued from them. Ravenswood stopped, and as, after a moment's pause, he again advanced towards her, Alice, or her apparition, moved or glided backwards towards the thicket, still keeping her face turned towards him. The trees soon hid the form from his sight, and yielding to the strong and terrific impression that the being which he had seen was not of this world, the Master of Ravenswood remained rooted to the ground whereon he had stood when he caught his last view of her. At length, summoning up his courage, he advanced to the spot on which the figure had seemed to be seated, but neither was there pressure of the grass, nor any other circumstance, to induce him to believe that what he had seen was real and substantial. Full of those strange thoughts and confused apprehensions which awake in the bosom of one who conceives he has witnessed some preternatural appearance, the Master of Ravenswood walked back towards his horse, frequently, however, looking behind him, not without apprehension, as if expecting that the vision would reappear. But the apparition, whether it was real or whether it was the creation of a heated and agitated imagination, returned not again, and he found his horse sweating and terrified, as if experiencing that agony of fear with which the presence of a supernatural being is supposed to agitate the brute creation. The Master mounted, and rode slowly forward, soothing his steed from time to time, while the animal seemed internally to shrink and shudder, as if expecting some new object of fear at the opening of every glade. The rider, after a moment's consideration, resolved to investigate the matter further. "Can my eyes have deceived me," he said, "and deceived me for such a space of time? Or are this woman's infirmities but feigned, in order to excite compassion? And even then, her motion resembled not that of a living and existing person. Must I adopt the popular creed, and think that the unhappy being has formed a league with the powers of darkness? I am determined to be resolved. I will not brook imposition even from my own eyes." In this uncertainty, he rode up to the little wicket of Alice's garden. Her seat beneath the birch tree was vacant, though the day was pleasant, and the sun was high. He approached the hut, and heard from within the sobs and wailings of a female. No answer was returned when he knocked, so that, after a moment's pause, he lifted the latch and entered. It was indeed a house of solitude and sorrow. Stretched upon her miserable pallet lay the corpse of the last retainer of the house of Ravenswood, who still abode on their paternal domains. Life had but shortly departed, and the little girl by whom she had been attended in her last moments was wringing her hands and sobbing, betwixt childish fear and sorrow over the body of her mistress. The Master of Ravenswood had some difficulty to compose the terrors of the poor child, whom his unexpected appearance had at first rather appalled than comforted, and when he succeeded, the first expression which the girl used intimated that he had come too late. Upon inquiring the meaning of this expression, he learned that the deceased, upon the first attack of the mortal agony, had sent a peasant to the castle to beseech an interview of the Master of Ravenswood, and had expressed the utmost impatience for his return. But the messengers of the poor are tardy and negligent. The fellow had not reached the castle, as was afterwards learned, until Ravenswood had left it, and had then found too much amusement among the retinue of the strangers to return in any haste to the cottage of Alice. Meanwhile, her anxiety of mind seemed to increase with the agony of her body, and, to use the phrase of Baby, her only attendant, she prayed powerfully that she might see her master's son once more, and renew her warning. She died just as the clock in the distant village tolled 1, and Ravenswood remembered, with internal shuddering, that he had heard the chime sound through the wood, just before he had seen what he was now much disposed to consider as the spectre of the deceased. It was necessary, as well from his respect to the departed as in common humanity to her terrified attendant, that he should take some measures to relieve the girl from her distressing situation. The deceased, he understood, had expressed a desire to be buried in a solitary churchyard, near the little inn of the Tod's Hole, called the Hermitage, or more commonly Armitage, in which lay interred some of the Ravenswood family, and many of their followers. Ravenswood conceived it his duty to gratify this predilection, commonly found to exist among the Scottish peasantry, and dispatched Baby to the neighbouring village to procure the assistance of some females, assuring her that, in the meanwhile, he would himself remain with the dead body, which, as in Thessaly of old, it is accounted highly unfit to leave without a watch. Thus, in the course of a quarter of an hour or little more, he found himself sitting a solitary guard over the inanimate corpse of her whose dismissed spirit, unless his eyes had strangely deceived him, had so recently manifested itself before him. Notwithstanding his natural courage, the Master was considerably affected by a concurrence of circumstances so extraordinary. "She died expressing her eager desire to see me. Can it be, then," was his natural course of reflection, "can strong and earnest wishes, formed during the last agony of nature, survive its catastrophe, surmount the awful bounds of the spiritual world, and place before us its inhabitants in the hues and colouring of life? And why was that manifested to the eye which could not unfold its tale to the ear? And wherefore should a breach be made in the laws of nature, yet its purpose remain unknown? Vain questions, which only death, when it shall make me like the pale and withered form before me, can ever resolve." He laid a cloth, as he spoke, over the lifeless face, upon whose features he felt unwilling any longer to dwell. He then took his place in an old carved oaken chair, ornamented with his own armorial bearings, which Alice had contrived to appropriate to her own use in the pillage which took place among creditors, officers, domestics, and messengers of the law, when his father left Ravenswood Castle for the last time. Thus seated, he banished, as much as he could, the superstitious feelings which the late incident naturally inspired. His own were sad enough, without the exaggeration of supernatural terror, since he found himself transferred from the situation of a successful lover of Lucy Ashton, and an honoured and respected friend of her father, into the melancholy and solitary guardian of the abandoned and forsaken corpse of a common pauper. He was relieved, however, from his sad office sooner than he could reasonably have expected, considering the distance betwixt the hut of the deceased and the village, and the age and infirmities of 3 old women who came from thence, in military phrase, to relieve guard upon the body of the defunct. On any other occasion, the speed of these reverend sibyls would have been much more moderate, for the first was 80 years of age and upwards, the second was paralytic, and the third lame of a leg from some accident. But the burial duties rendered to the deceased are, to the Scottish peasant of either sex, a labour of love. I know not whether it is from the temper of the people, grave and enthusiastic as it certainly is, or from the recollection of the ancient Catholic opinions, when the funeral rites were always considered as a period of festival to the living, but feasting, good cheer, and even inebriety were and are the frequent accompaniments of a Scottish old-fashioned burial. What the funeral feast, or dirgie, as it is called, was to the men, the gloomy preparations of the dead body for the coffin were to the women. To straight the contorted limbs upon a board used for that melancholy purpose, to array the corpse in clean linen, and over that in its woollen shroud, were operations committed always to the old matrons of the village, and in which they found a singular and gloomy delight. The old women paid the master their salutations with a ghastly smile, which reminded him of the meeting betwixt Macbeth and the witches on the blasted heath of Forres. He gave them some money, and recommended to them the charge of the dead body of their contemporary, an office which they willingly undertook, intimating to him at the same time that he must leave the hut in order that they might begin their mournful duties. Ravenswood readily agreed to depart, only tarrying to recommend to them due attention to the body, and to receive information where he was to find the sexton, or beadle, who had in charge the deserted churchyard of the Armitage, in order to prepare matters for the reception of old Alice in the place of repose which she had selected for herself. "You'll no be pinched to find out Johnny Mortsheugh," said the elder Sibyl, and still her withered cheek bore a grisly smile. "He dwells near the Tod's Hole, a house of entertainment where there has been mony a blithe birling, for death and drink draining are near neighbours to ane another." "Ay, and that's e'en true, cummer," said the lame hag, propping herself with a crutch which supported the shortness of her left leg. "For I mind when the father of this Master of Ravenswood that is now standing before us sticked young Blackhall with his whinger for a wrang word said ower their wine, or brandy, or what not. He gaed in as light as a bark, and he came out wi' his feet foremost. I was at the winding of the corpse, and when the blood was washed off, he was a bonny bowk of man's body." It may be easily believed that this ill-timed anecdote hastened the master's purpose of quitting a company so evil-omened and so odious. Yet, while walking to the tree to which his horse was tied, and busying himself with adjusting the girths of the saddle, he could not avoid hearing, through the hedge of the little garden, a conversation respecting himself betwixt the lame woman and the octogenarian Sibyl. The pair had hobbled into the garden to gather rosemary, southernwood, rue, and other plants proper to be strewed upon the body, and burned by way of fumigation in the chimney of the cottage. The paralytic wretch, almost exhausted by the journey, was left guard upon the corpse, lest witches or fiends might play their sport with it. The following low, croaking dialogue was necessarily overheard by the Master of Ravenswood. "That's a fresh and full-grown hemlock, Annie Winnie. Mony a cummer lang syne wad he sought nae better horse to flee over hill and howe, through mist and moonlight, and light down in the King of France's cellar." "Ay, cummer, but the very deil has turned as hard-hearted now as the Lord Keeper and the grit folk, that hae breasts like whinstane. They prick us and they pine us, and they pit us on the pinnywinkles for witches, and if I say my prayers backwards 10 times ower, Satan will never gie me amends o' them." "Did you ever see the foul thief?" asked her neighbour. "Na," replied the other spokeswoman, "but I trow I hae dreamed o' him mony a time, and I think the day will come they will burn me for't. But ne'er mind, cummer, we hae this dollar of the master's, and we'll send doun for bread and for yill, and tobacco, and a drap brandy to burn, and a wee pickle saft sugar, and be there deal or nae deal, lass, we'll hae a merry night o't." Here her leathern chops uttered a sort of cackling ghastly laugh, resembling to a certain degree the cry of the screech owl. "He's a frank man and a free-handed man, the master," said Annie Winnie, "and a comely personage, broad in the shouthers,
and narrow round the lunnies. He would mak a bonny corpse. I would like to hae the streaking and winding of him." "It is written on his brow, Annie Winnie," returned the octogenarian, her companion, "that hand of woman, or of man either, will never stracht him. Deal will never be laid on his back. Make you your market of that, for I hae it frae a sure hand." "Will it be his lot to die on the battle ground then, Ailsie Gourlay? Will he die by the sword or the ball, as his forebears had done before him, mony ane of them?" "Ask nae mair questions about it, he'll no be graced sae far," replied the sage. "I ken ye are wiser than other folk, Ailsie Gourlay, but wha telled ye this?" "Fash na your thumb about that, Annie Winnie," answered the sibyl. "I hae it frae a hand sure eneugh." "But ye said ye never saw the foul thief," reiterated her inquisitive companion. "I hae it frae as sure a hand," said Ailsie, "and frae them that spade his fortune before the sark gaed ower his head." "Hark! I hear his horse's feet riding aff," said the other. "They dinna sound as if good luck was with him." "Mak haste, sirs," cried the paralytic hag from the cottage, "and let us do what is needfu', and say what is fitting; for if the dead corpse be na strachted, it will girn and thraw, and that will fear the best o' us." Ravenswood was now out of hearing. He despised most of the ordinary prejudices about witchcraft, omens, and vaticination, to which his age and country still gave such implicit credit, that to express a doubt of them was accounted a crime equal to the unbelief of Jews or Saracens. He knew also that the prevailing belief concerning witches, operating upon the hypochondriac habits of those whom age, infirmity, and poverty rendered liable to suspicion, and enforced by the fear of death and the pangs of the most cruel tortures, often extorted those confessions which encumber and disgrace the criminal records of Scotland during the 17th century. But the vision of that morning, whether real or imaginary, had impressed his mind with a superstitious feeling, which he in vain endeavoured to shake off. The nature of the business which awaited him at the little inn called Todd's Hole, where he soon after arrived, was not of a kind to restore his spirits. It was necessary he should see Mortsheugh, the sexton of the old burial ground at Armitage, to arrange matters for the funeral of Alice; and as the man dwelt near the place of her late residence, the Master, after a slight refreshment, walked towards the place where the body of Alice was to be deposited. It was situated in the nook formed by the eddying sweep of a stream, which issued from the adjoining hills. A rude cavern in an adjacent rock, which in the interior was cut into the shape of a cross, formed the hermitage, where some Saxon saint had in ancient times done penance, and given name to the place. The rich Abbey of Coldingham had, in latter days, established a chapel in the neighbourhood, of which no vestige was now visible, though the churchyard which surrounded it was still, as upon the present occasion, used for the interment of particular persons. One or two shattered yew trees still grew within the precincts of that which had once been holy ground. Warriors and barons had been buried there of old, but their names were forgotten, and their monuments demolished. The only sepulchral memorials which remained were the upright headstones which mark the graves of persons of inferior rank. The abode of the sexton was a solitary cottage adjacent to the ruined wall of the cemetery, but so low that with its thatch, which nearly reached the ground, covered with a thick crop of grass, fog, and house leeks, it resembled an overgrown grave. On inquiry, however, Ravenswood found that the man of the last mattock was absent at a bridal, being fiddler as well as gravedigger to the vicinity. He therefore retired to the little inn, leaving a message that early next morning he would again call for the person whose double occupation connected him at once with the house of mourning and the house of feasting. An outrider of the Marquis arrived at Todd's Hole shortly after, with a message intimating that his master would join Ravenswood at that place on the following morning, and the Master, who would otherwise have proceeded to his old retreat at Wolf's Crag, remained there accordingly to give meeting to his noble kinsman. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of The Bride of Lammermoor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 24. Hamlet. Has this fellow no feeling of his business? He sings at grave-making. Horatio. Custom hath made it in him a property of easiness. Hamlet. 'Tis e'en so, the hand of little employment hath the daintier sense. Hamlet, Act 5, Scene 1. The sleep of Ravenswood was broken by ghastly and agitating visions, and his waking intervals disturbed by melancholy reflections on the past and painful anticipations of the future. He was perhaps the only traveller who ever slept in that miserable kennel without complaining of his lodgings, or feeling inconvenience from their deficiencies. It is when the mind is free, the body's delicate. Morning, however, found the master an early riser, in hopes that the fresh air of the dawn might afford the refreshment which night had refused him. He took his way towards the solitary burial ground, which lay about half a mile from the inn. The thin blue smoke, which already began to curl upward, and to distinguish the cottage of the living from the habitation of the dead, apprised him that its inmate had returned and was stirring. Accordingly, on entering the little churchyard, he saw the old man labouring in a half-made grave. "My destiny," thought Ravenswood, "seems to lead me to scenes of fate and of death, but these are childish thoughts, and they shall not master me. I will not again suffer my imagination to beguile my senses." The old man rested on his spade as the master approached him, as if to receive his commands, and as he did not immediately speak, the sexton opened the discourse in his own way. "Ye will be a wedding customer, sir, I'se warrant?" "What makes you think so, friend?" replied the master. "I live by twa trades, sir," replied the blithe old man. "Fiddle, sir, and spade, filling the world and emptying of it, and I should ken baith cast of customers by head mark in 30 years' practice." "You are mistaken, however, this morning," replied Ravenswood. "Am I?" said the old man, looking keenly at him. "Troth, and it may be, since, for as brent as your brow is, there is something sitting upon it this day that is as near akin to death as to wedlock. Weel, weel, the pick and shovel are as ready to your order as bow and fiddle." "I wish you," said Ravenswood, "to look after the decent interment of an old woman, Alice Gray, who lived at the Craigfoot in Ravenswood Park." "Alice Gray? Blind Alice?" said the sexton, "and is she gane at last? That's another jow of the bell, to bid me be ready. I mind when Habby Gray brought her down to this land, a likely lass she was then, and looked ower her southland nose at us a'. I trow her pride got a downcome. And is she e'en gane?" "She died yesterday," said Ravenswood, "and desired to be buried here beside her husband. You know where he lies, no doubt?" "Ken where he lies?" answered the sexton, with national indirection of response. "I ken where a'body lies that lies here. But ye were speaking o' her grave. Lord help us, it's no an ordinar grave that will haud her in, if a's true that folk said of Alice in her auld days, and if I gie to 6 feet deep, and a warlock's grave shouldna be an inch mair ebb, or her ain witch cummers would soon whirl her out of her shroud for a' their auld acquaintance. And be it 6 feet or be it 3, wha's to pay the making o't, I pray ye?" "I will pay you that, my friend, and all other reasonable charges." "Reasonable charges?" said the sexton. "Oh, there's grund mail, and bell siller, though the bell's broken, nae doubt, and the kist, and my day's work, and my bit fee, and some brandy and yill and the dirgie. I'm no thinking that ye can inter her, to ca' decently, under 16 pund Scots." "There is the money, my friend," said Ravenswood, "and something over. Be sure you know the grave." "Ye'll be ane of her English relations, I'se warrant," said the hoary man of skulls. "I hae heard she married far below her station.
It was very right to let her bite on the bridle while she was living, and it's very right to gie her a decent burial now she's dead, for that's a matter of credit to yoursell rather than to her. Folk may let their kindred shift for themselves while they are alive, and can bear the burden of their ain misdoings, but it's an unnatural thing to let them be buried like dogs, when all the discredit gangs to the kindred. What kens the dead corpse about it?" "You would not have people neglect their relations on a bridal occasion neither," said Ravenswood, who was amused with the professional limitation of the grave-digger's philanthropy. The old man cast up his sharp grey eyes with a shrewd smile, as if he understood the jest, but instantly continued with his former gravity. "Bridals? Wha would neglect bridals that had only regard for plenishing the earth? To be sure, they should be celebrated with all manner of good cheer, and meeting of friends, and musical instruments, harp, sackbut, and psaltery, or good fiddle and pipes, when these old-world instruments of melody are hard to be compassed." "The presence of the fiddle, I dare say," replied Ravenswood, "would atone for the absence of all the others." The sexton again looked sharply up at him, as he answered, "Nae doubt, nae doubt, if it were weel played. But yonder," he said, as if to change the discourse, "is Halbert Gray's lang hame that ye were speiring after, just the third burrock beyond the muckle throw-stane that stands on sax legs yonder, abune some yin of the Ravenswoods, for there is mony of their kin and followers here, deil lift them, though it isna just their main burial place." "They are no favourites then of yours, these Ravenswoods?" said the Master, not much pleased with the passing benediction which was thus bestowed on his family and name. "I ken na wha should favour them," said the gravedigger. "When they had lands and power, they were ill guides of them baith, and now their heads down, there's few care how lang they may be of lifting it again." "Indeed," said Ravenswood, "I never heard that this unhappy family deserved ill will at the hands of their country. I grant their poverty, if that renders them contemptible." "It will gang a far way till't," said the sexton of Hermitage. "Ye may tak my word for that. At least, I ken nothing else that should mak myself contemptible, and folk are far frae respecting me as they wad do if I lived in a twa-lofted sclated house. But as for the Ravenswoods, I hae seen 3 generations of them, and deil yin to mend other." "I thought they had enjoyed a fair character in the country," said their descendant. "Character? Oh, ye see, sir," said the sexton, "as for the auld gude sir body of a lord, I lived on his land when I was a swanking young chiel, and could hae blawn the trumpet wi' onybody, for I had wind eneugh then; and touching this trumpeter marine that I have heard play before the lords of the circuit, I would hae made nae mair of him than of a bairn and a bawbee whistle. I defy him to hae played boot and saddle, or horsing away, or gallants come trot, with me. He hadna the tones." "But what is all this to old Lord Ravenswood, my friend?" said the Master, who, with an anxiety not unnatural in his circumstances, was desirous of prosecuting the musician's first topic. "What had his memory to do with the degeneracy of the trumpet music?" "Just this, sir," answered the sexton, "that I lost my wind in his service. You see, I was trumpeter at the castle, and had allowance for blawing at break of day, and at dinner time, and other whiles when there was company about, and it pleased my lord; and when he raised his militia to caper awa to Bothwell Brig against the wrang-headed Westland Whigs, I behoved, reason or nane, to munt a horse and caper awa wi' them." "And very reasonable," said Ravenswood. "You were his servant and vassal." "Servitor, say ye?" replied the sexton; "and so I was, but it was to blaw folk to their warm dinner, or, at the worst, to a decent kirkyard, and no to skirl them awa to a bloody braeside, where there was deil a bedral but the hooded craw. But bide ye shall hear what came o't, and how far I am bund to be bidsman to the Ravenswoods. Dilt ye see, we gaed on a braw summer morning, 24th of June, 1679, of a' the days of the month and year. Drums beat, guns rattled, horses kicked and trampled, Haxton of Rathillet keepit the brig, wi' musket and carabine and pike, sword and scythe for what I ken, and we horsemen were ordered down to cross at the ford. I hate fords at all times, let a be when there's thousands of armed men on the other side. There was auld Ravenswood brandishing his Andrew Ferrara at the head, and crying to us to come and buckle to, as if we had been gone to a fair. There was Caleb Balderstone, that is living yet, flourishing in the rear, and swearing Gog and Magog he would put steel through the guts of ony man that turned bridle. There was young Alan Ravenswood, that was then master, wi' a bended pistol in his hand, it was a mercy it gaed na aff, crying to me that had scarce as much wind left as serve the necessary purpose of my ain lungs, "Sound, you poltroon, sound, you damned cowardly villain, or I will blow your brains out." And to be sure, I blew 6 points of war that the scroch of a clockin hen was music to them. "Well, sir, cut all this short," said Ravenswood. "Short? I had like to hae been cut short mysell in the flower of my youth, as Scripture says, and that's the very thing that I complain o'. Weel, into the water we behoved a' to splash, heels our head, sit or fa, ae horse driving on another, as is the way of brute beasts, and riders that hae as little sense. The very bushes on the other side were ablaze with the flashes of the Whig guns, and my horse had just ta'en the grund when a black of eyes Westland carle, I would mind the face of him 100 years yet, an ee like a wild falcon's, and a beard as broad as my shovel, clapped the end of his long black gun within a quarter's length of my lug. By the grace of mercy, the horse swerved round, and I fell aff at the tae side as the ball whistled by at the tither, and the fell auld lord took the Whig such a whack wi' his broadsword that he made twa pieces o' his head, and down fell the lurdance wi' a' his bowk abune me." "You were rather obliged to the old lord, I think," said Ravenswood. "Was I? My certie! First for bringing me into jeopardy, would I nould I, and then for whommling a chield on the tap of me that dang the very wind out of my body. I hae been short breathed ever since, and canna gang 20 yards without pechin like a miller's aver." "You lost, then, your place as trumpeter?" said Ravenswood. "Lost it! To be sure I lost it," replied the sexton, "for I couldna hae played pew upon a dry hemlock. But I might hae done weel eneugh, for I keepit the wage in the free house, and little to do but play on the fiddle to them, but for Alan, last Lord Ravenswood, that was far waur than ever his father was." "What," said the master, "did his father's son, this last Lord Ravenswood, deprive you of what the bounty of his father allowed you?" "Ay, troth did he," answered the old man, "for he loot his affairs gang to the dogs, and let in this Sir William Ashton on us, that will gie naething for naething, and just removed me and a' the puir creatures that had bite and soup at the castle, and a hole to put our heads in, when things were in the auld way." "If Lord Ravenswood protected his people, my friend, while he had the means of doing so, I think they might spare his memory," replied the master. "Ye're welcome to your ain opinion, sir," said the sexton, "but ye winna persuade me that he did his duty, either to himsell or to his pair dependent creatures, in guiding us the gate he has done. He might hae gien us life rent tax of our bits of houses and yards, and me, that's an auld man, living in yon miserable cabin, that's fitter for the dead than the quick, and killed wi' rheumatism, and John Smith in my dainty bit mailing, and his window glazing, and a' because Ravenswood guided his gear like a fool." "It is but too true," said Ravenswood, conscience struck. "The penalties of extravagance extend far beyond the prodigal's own sufferings." "However," said the sexton, "this young man Edgar is like to avenge my wrangs on the hale of his kindred." "Indeed?" said Ravenswood. "Why should you suppose so?" "They say he is about to marry the daughter of Lady Ashton, and let her ladyship get his head yince under her oxta, and see you if she winna gie his neck a thraw. Sorra a bit if I were him. Let her alane for hauding a' thing in het water that draws near her. Say the worst wish I shall wish the lad is, that he may take his ain creditable gate o't, and ally himsell wi' his father's enemies, that he'd taken his broad lands and my bonny kail-yard from the lawful owners thereof." Cervantes acutely remarks that flattery is pleasing even from the mouth of a madman, and censure, as well as praise, often affects us while we despise the opinions and motives on which it is founded and expressed. Ravenswood, abruptly reiterating his command that Alice's funeral should be attended to, flung away from the sexton, under the painful impression that the great as well as the small vulgar would think of his engagement with Lucy like this ignorant and selfish peasant. "And I have stooped to subject myself to these calumnies, and am rejected notwithstanding. Lucy, your faith must be true and perfect as the diamond, to compensate for the dishonour which men's opinions and the conduct of your mother attach to the heir of Ravenswood." As he raised his eyes, he beheld the Marquis of A., who, having arrived at the Tod's Hole, had walked forth to look for his kinsman. After mutual greetings, he made some apology to the Master for not coming forward on the preceding evening. It was his wish, he said, to have done so, but he had come to the knowledge of some matters which induced him to delay his purpose. "I find," he proceeded, "there has been a love affair here, kinsman, and though I might blame you for not having communicated with me, as being in some degree the chief of your family—" "With your lordship's permission," said Ravenswood, "I am deeply grateful for the interest you are pleased to take in me, but I am the chief and head of my family." I know it," said the Marquis. "In a strict heraldic and genealogical sense, you certainly are so. What I mean is, that being in some measure under my guardianship—" "I must take the liberty to say, my lord," answered Ravenswood, and the tone in which he interrupted the Marquis boded no long duration to the friendship of the noble relatives, when he himself was interrupted by the little sexton, who came puffing after them to ask if their honours would choose music at the change-house to make up for short cheer. "We want no music," said the Master abruptly. "Your honour doesna ken what you're refusing, then," said the fiddler, with the impertinent freedom of his profession. "I can play 'Wilt thou do't again?' and 'The Auld Man's Mear's-Deed,' 6 times better than ever Patty Birnie. I'll get my fiddle in the turning of a coffin screw." "Take yourself away, sir," said the Marquis. "And if your honour be a north country gentleman," said the persevering minstrel, "whilk I would judge from your tongue, I can play 'Liggeram Cosh' and 'Millen Dhu,' and the 'Cummers of Athol.'" "Take yourself away, friend; you interrupt our conversation." "Or, if, under your honour's favour, you should happen to be a thought honest, I can play," this in a low and confidential tone, "Killiecrankie, and 'The King shall hae his ain,' and 'The Auld Stuart's back again.' And the wife at the change-house is a decent discreet body, neither kens nor cares what toasts are drunken and what tunes are played in her house. She's deaf to a'thing but the clink of the siller." The Marquis, who was sometimes suspected of Jacobitism, could not help laughing as he threw the fellow $1, and bid him go play to the servants, if he had a mind, and leave them at peace. "Aweel, gentlemen," said he, "I am wishing your honours good day. I'll be a' the better of the $1, and ye'll be the waur o' wanting music, I'll tell ye. But I'se gang hame and finish the grave in the tuning of a fiddle-string, lay by my spade, and then get my tother breadwinner and awa to your folk, and see if they hae better lugs than their masters." End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of The Bride of Lammermoor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Henry. The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 25. True love, and thou be true, thou hast yin kittle part to play, for fortune, fashion, fancy, and thou maun strive for many a day. I've kenned by mony a friend's tale far better by this heart of mine What time and change of fancy avail a true love not to untwine? Henderson. I wish to tell you, my good kinsman, said the Marquis, now that we are quit of that impertinent fiddler, that I had tried to discuss this love affair of yours with Sir William Ashton's daughter. I never saw the young lady but for a few minutes to-day, so, being a stranger to her personal merits, I pay a compliment to you, and offer her no offence, in saying you might do better. My lord, I am much indebted for the interest you have taken in my affairs, said Ravenswood. I did not intend to have troubled you in any matter concerning Miss Ashton. As my engagement with that young lady has reached your lordship, I can only say that you must necessarily suppose that I was aware of the objections to my marrying into her father's family, and of course must have been completely satisfied with the reasons by which these objections are overbalanced, since I have proceeded so far in the matter. Nay, master, if you had heard me out, said his noble relation, you might have spared that observation, for, without questioning that you had reasons which seemed to you to counterbalance every other obstacle, I set myself, by every means that it became me to use towards the Ashtons, to persuade them to meet your views. I am obliged to your lordship for your unsolicited intercession, said Ravenswood, especially as I am sure your lordship would never carry it beyond the bounds which it became me to use. Of that, said the Marquis, you may be confident. I myself felt the delicacy of the matter too much to place a gentleman nearly connected with my house in a degrading or dubious situation with these Ashtons, but I pointed out all the advantages of their marrying their daughter into a house so honourable, and so nearly related with the first of Scotland. I explained the exact degree of relationship in which the Ravenswoods stand to ourselves, and I even hinted how political matters were like to turn, and what cards would be trumps next Parliament. I said I regarded you as a son, or a nephew or so, rather than as a more distant relation, and that I made your affair entirely my own. And what was the issue of your lordship's explanation? Said Ravenswood, in some doubt whether he should resent or express gratitude for his interference. Why, the Lord Keeper would have listened to reason, said the Marquis. He is rather unwilling to leave his place, which, in the present view of a change, must be vacated. And to say truth, he seemed to have a liking for you, and to be sensible of the general advantages to be attained by such a match. But his lady, who is tongue of the trump, master? What of Lady Ashton, my lord? Said Ravenswood. Let me know the issue of this extraordinary conference. I can bear it. I am glad of that, kinsman, said the Marquis, for I am ashamed to tell you half what she said. It is enough. Her mind is made up, and the mistress of a first-rate boarding-school could not have rejected with more haughty indifference the suit of a half-pay Irish officer, beseeching permission to wait upon the heiress of a West India planter, than Lady Ashton spurned every proposal of mediation which it could at all become me to offer in behalf of you, my good kinsman. I cannot guess what she means. A more honourable connection she could not form, that's certain. As for money and land, that used to be her husband's business rather than hers. I really think she hates you for having the rank which her husband has not, and perhaps for not having the lands that her good man has. But I should only vex you to say more about it. Here we are at the change house. The Master of Ravenswood paused as he entered the cottage, which reeked through all its crevices, and they were not few, from the exertions of the Marquis's travelling cooks, to supply good cheer and spread, as it were, a table in the wilderness. My Lord Marquis, said Ravenswood. "I already mentioned that accident has put your lordship in possession of a secret which, with my consent, should have remained one even to you, my kinsman, for some time. Since the secret was to part from my own custody, and that of the only person besides who was interested in it, I am not sorry it should have reached your lordship's ears, as being fully aware that you are my noble kinsman and friend." "You may believe it is safely lodged with me, Master of Ravenswood," said the Marquis; "but I should like well to hear you say that you renounced the idea of an alliance which you can hardly pursue without a certain degree of degradation." "Of that, my lord, I shall judge," answered Ravenswood, "and I hope with delicacy as sensitive as any of my friends. But I have no engagement with Sir William and Lady Ashton. It is with Miss Ashton alone that I have entered upon the subject, and my conduct in the matter shall be entirely ruled by hers. If she continues to prefer me, in my poverty, to the wealthier suitors whom her friends recommend, I may well make some sacrifice to her sincere affection. I may well surrender to her the less tangible and less palpable advantages of birth, and the deep-rooted prejudices of family hatred. If Miss Lucy Ashton should change her mind on a subject of such delicacy, I trust my friends will be silent on my disappointment, and I shall know how to make my enemies so." "Spoke like a gallant young nobleman," said the Marquis. "For my part, I have that regard for you that I should be sorry the thing went on. This Sir William Ashton was a pretty enough pettifogging kind of a lawyer 20 years ago, and betwixt battling at the bar and leading in committees of Parliament, he has got well on. The Darien matter lent him a lift, for he had good intelligence and sound views, and sold out in time. But the best work is had out of him. No government will take him at his own, or rather his wife's, extravagant valuation; and betwixt his indecision and her insolence, from all I can guess, he will outsit his market, and be had cheap when no one will bid for him. I say nothing of Miss Ashton, but I assure you, a connection with her father will be neither useful nor ornamental, beyond that part of your father's spoils which he may be prevailed upon to disgorge by way of tochergood; and take my word for it, you will get more if you have spirit to bell the cat with him in the House of Peers. And I will be the man, cousin," continued his lordship, "will course the fox for you, and make him rue the day that ever he refused a composition too honourable for him, and proposed by me on the behalf of a kinsman." There was something in all this that, as it were, overshot the mark. Ravenswood could not disguise from himself that his noble kinsman had more reason for taking offence at the reception of his suit than regarded his interest and honour. Yet he could neither complain nor be surprised that it should be so. He contented himself, therefore, with repeating that his attachment was to Miss Ashton personally, that he desired neither wealth nor aggrandisement from her father's means and influence, and that nothing should prevent his keeping his engagement, excepting her own express desire that it should be relinquished; and he requested as a favour that the matter might be no more mentioned betwixt them at present, assuring the Marquis of A that he should be his confidant or its interruption. The Marquis soon had more agreeable, as well as more interesting, subjects on which to converse. A footpost, who had followed him from Edinburgh to Ravenswood Castle, and had traced his steps to the Tod's Hole, laden with good news. The political calculations of the Marquis had proved just, both in London and at Edinburgh, and he saw almost within his grasp the preeminence for which he had panted. The refreshments which the servants had prepared were now put on the table, and an epicure would perhaps have enjoyed them, with additional zest from the contrast which such fare afforded to the miserable cabin in which it was served up. The turn of conversation corresponded with and added to the social feelings of the company. the Marquis expanded with pleasure on the power which probably incidents were likely to assign to him, and on the use which he hoped to make of it in serving his kinsman Ravenswood. Ravenswood could but repeat the gratitude which he really felt, even when he considered the topic as too long dwelt upon. The wine was excellent, notwithstanding its having been brought in a runlet from Edinburgh, and the habits of the Marquis, when engaged with such good cheer, were somewhat sedentary, and so it fell out that they delayed their journey 2 hours later than was their original purpose. "But what of that, my good young friend?" said the Marquis. "Your castle of Wolf's Crag is at but 5 or 6 miles distance, and will afford the same hospitality to your kinsman of A that it gave to this same Sir William Ashton." "Sir William took the castle by storm," said Ravenswood, "and, like many a victor, had little reason to congratulate himself on his conquest." "Well, well," said Lord A, whose dignity was something relaxed by the wine he had drunk, "I see I must bribe you to harbour me. Come, pledge me in a bumper health to the last young lady that slept at Wolf's Crag, and liked her quarters. My bones are not so tender as hers, and I am resolved to occupy her apartment to-night, that I may judge how hard the couch is that love can soften." "Your lordship may choose what penance you please," said Ravenswood, "but I assure you I should expect my old servant to hang himself or throw himself from the battlements, should your lordship visit him so unexpectedly. I do assure you we are totally and literally unprovided." But his declaration only brought from his noble patron an assurance of his own total indifference as to every species of accommodation, and his determination to see the Tower of Wolf's Crag. His ancestor, he said, had been feasted there, when he went forward with the then Lord Ravenswood to the fatal battle of Flodden, in which they both fell. Thus hard pressed, the Master offered to ride forward to get matters put in such preparation as time and circumstances admitted, but the Marquis protested his kinsman must afford him his company, and would only consent that an avant courier should carry to the destined seneschal, Caleb Balderstone, the unexpected news of this invasion. The Master of Ravenswood soon after accompanied the Marquis in his carriage, as the latter had proposed, and when they became better acquainted in the progress of the journey, his noble relation explained the very liberal views which he entertained for his relation's preferment, in case of the success of his own political schemes. They related to a secret and highly important commission beyond sea, which could only be entrusted to a person of rank, talent, and perfect confidence, and which, as it required great trust and reliance on the envoy employed, could but not prove both honourable and advantageous to him. We need not enter into the nature and purpose of this commission, farther than to acquaint our readers that the charge was in prospect highly acceptable to the Master of Ravenswood, who hailed with pleasure the hope of emerging from his present state of indigence and inaction into independence and honourable exertion. While he listened thus eagerly to the details with which the Marquis now thought it necessary to entrust him, the messenger who had been dispatched to the Tower of Wolf's Crag returned with Caleb Balderstone's humble duty, and an assurance that "a' should be in seemly order, sic as the hurry of time permitted, to receive their lordships as it behoved." Ravenswood was too well accustomed to his seneschal's mode of acting and speaking to hope much from this confident assurance. He knew that Caleb acted upon the principle of the Spanish generals in the campaign of —, who, much to the perplexity of the Prince of Orange, their commander-in-chief, used to report their troops as full in number and possessed of all necessary points of equipment, not considering it consistent with their dignity or the honour of Spain to confess any deficiency either in men or munition, until the want of both was unavoidably discovered in the day of battle. Accordingly, Ravenswood thought it necessary to give the Marquis some hint that the fair assurance which they had just received from Caleb did not by any means ensure them against a very indifferent reception. "You do yourself injustice, master," said the Marquis, "or you wish to surprise me agreeably. From this window I see a great light in the direction where, if I remember aright, Wolf's Crag lies, and to judge from the splendour which the old tower sheds around it, the preparations for our reception must be of no ordinary description. I remember your father putting the same deception on me when we went to the tower for a few days' hawking, about 20 years since, and yet we spent our time as jollily at Wolf's Crag as we could have done at my own hunting seat at B. Your lordship, I fear, will experience that the faculty of the present proprietor to entertain his friends is greatly abridged," said Ravenswood. "The will, I need hardly say, remains the same, but I am as much at a loss as your lordship to account for so strong and brilliant a light as is now above Wolf's Crag. The windows of the tower are few and narrow, and those of the lower story are hidden from us by the walls of the court. I cannot conceive that any illumination of an ordinary nature could afford such a blaze of light." The mystery was soon explained, for the cavalcade almost instantly halted, and the voice of Caleb Balderstone was heard at the coach window, exclaiming in accents broken by grief and fear, "Och, gentlemen! Och, my good lords! Och, haud to the right! Wolf's Crag is burning, bower and haw. A' the rich plenishing outside and inside, a' the fine graith, pictures, tapestries, needlework, hangings, and other decorements, a' in a blaze, as if they were nae mair than sae many peats, or as muckle peas stray. Haud to the right, gentlemen, I implore ye. There is some sma provision making at Lucky Smaw-Trash's, but oh, wae for this night, and wae for me that lives to see it." Ravenswood was first stunned by this new and unexpected calamity, but after a moment's recollection he sprang from the carriage, and hastily bidding his noble kinsman good night, was about to ascend the hill towards the castle, the broad and full conflagration of which now flung forth a high column of red light that flickered far to seaward upon the dashing waves of the ocean. "Take a horse, master," exclaimed the Marquis, greatly affected by this additional misfortune, so unexpectedly heaped upon his young protégé, "and give me my ambling palfrey. And haste forward, you knaves, to see what can be done to save the furniture, or to extinguish the fire. Ride, you knaves, for your lives." The attendants bustled together, and began to strike their horses with the spur, and call upon Caleb to show them the road. But the voice of that careful seneschal was heard above the tumult. "Oh, stop, sirs, stop! Turn bridle for the love of mercy! Add not loss of lives to the loss of world's gain. 30 barrels of powder, landed out of a Dunkirk dogger in the auld lord's time, on the vaults of the auld tower. The fire canna be far off it, I trow. Lord's sake, to the right, lads, to the right! Let's pit the hill atween us in peril. A whap wi' a cornerstane of Wolf's Crag would defy the doctor." It will readily be supposed that this annunciation hurried the Marquis and his attendants into the route which Caleb prescribed, dragging Ravenswood along with them, although there was much in the matter which he could not possibly comprehend. "Gunpowder!" he exclaimed, laying hold of Caleb, who in vain endeavoured to escape from him. "What gunpowder? How any quantity of powder could be in Wolf's Crag without my knowledge, I cannot possibly comprehend." "But I can," interrupted the Marquis, whispering him. "I can comprehend it thoroughly. For God's sake, ask him no more questions at present." "There it is now," said Caleb, extricating himself from his master, and adjusting his dress. "Your honour will believe his lordship's honourable testimony. His lordship minds weel how, in the year that him they ca'd King Willie died—" "Hush, hush, my good friend," said the Marquis. "I shall satisfy your master upon that subject." "And the people at Wolf's Hope," said Ravenswood, "did none of them come to your assistance before the flame got so high?" "Ay, did they, mony ane of them, the rapscallions," said Caleb; "but truly I was in nae hurry to let them into the tower,
where there were so much plate and valuables." "Confound you for an impudent liar," said Ravenswood, in uncontrollable ire. "There was not a single ounce of—" "Forbye," said the butler, most irreverently raising his voice to a pitch which drowned his master's, "the fire made fast on us, owing to the store of tapestry and carved timmer in the banqueting hall, and the loons ran like scalded rats sae soon as they heard of the gunpowder." "I do entreat," said the Marquis to Ravenswood, "you will ask him no more questions." "Only one, my lord. What has become of poor Mysie?" "Mysie!" said Caleb. "I had nae time to look about ony Mysie. She's in the tower, I'se warrant, biding her awful doom." "By heaven!" said Ravenswood, "I do not understand all this. The life of a faithful old creature is at stake. My lord, I will be withheld no longer. I will at least ride up and see whether the danger is as imminent as this old fool pretends." "Weel, then, as I live by bread," said Caleb, "Mysie is weel and safe. I saw her out of the castle before I left it mysell. Was I ganging to forget an old fellow's servant?" "What made you tell me the contrary this moment?" said his master. "Did I tell you the contrary?" said Caleb. "Then I maun hae been dreaming surely, or this awesome night has turned my judgment. But safe she is, and ne'er a living soul in the castle, a' the better for them. They will have gotten an unco easy." The Master of Ravenswood, upon this assurance being solemnly reiterated, and notwithstanding his extreme wish to witness the last explosion, which was to ruin to the ground the mansion of his fathers, suffered himself to be dragged onward towards the village of Wolf's Hope, where not only the change house, but that of our well-known friend the cooper, were all prepared for reception of himself and his noble guest, with a liberality of provision which requires some explanation. We omitted to mention in its place that Lockhard, having fished out the truth concerning the mode by which Caleb had obtained the supplies for his banquet, the Lord Keeper, amused with the incident, and desirous at the time to gratify Ravenswood, had recommended the Cooper of Wolf's Hope to the official situation under government, the prospect of which had reconciled him to the loss of his wild fowl. Mr. Girder's preferment had occasioned a pleasing surprise to old Caleb, for when, some days after his master's departure, he found himself absolutely compelled, by some necessary business, to visit the fishing hamlet, and was gliding like a ghost past the door of the cooper for fear of being summoned to give some account of the progress of the solicitation in his favour, or, more probably, that the inmates might upbraid him with the false hope he had held out upon the subject, he heard himself, not without some apprehension, summoned at once in treble, tenor, and bass, a trio performed by the voices of Mrs. Girder, old Dame Loup the Dyke, and the goodman of the dwelling. "Mr. Caleb! Mr. Caleb Balderstone! I hope ye arena ganging dry-lipped by our door, and we sae muckle indebted to you." This might be said ironically as well as in earnest. Caleb augured the worst, turned a deaf ear to the trio aforesaid, and was moving doggedly on, his ancient castor pulled over his brows, and his eyes bent on the ground, as if to count the flinty pebbles with which the rude pathway was causewayed. But on a sudden he found himself surrounded in his progress, like a stately merchantman in the gut of Gibraltar, I hope the ladies will excuse the tarpaulin phrase, by 3 Algerine galleys. "Good guide us, Mr. Balderstone," said Mrs. Girder. "Wha wad hae thought it of an auld and kenned friend?" said the mother. "And no sae muckle as stay to receive our thanks," said the cooper himself, "and frae the like o' me that seldom offers them. I am sure I hope there's nae ill seed sawn between us, Mr. Balderstone. Ony man that has said to you I am no grateful for the situation of Queen's cooper, let me hae a wample at him wi' mine each, that's a'." "My good friends, my dear friends," said Caleb, still doubting how the certainty of the matter might stand, "what needs all this ceremony? Yin tries to serve their friends, and sometimes they may happen to prosper, and sometimes to misgie. Naething I care to be fashed with less than thanks. I never could bide them." "Faith, Mr. Balderstone, ye should have been fashed with few of mine," said the downright man of staves and hoops. "If I had only your good will to thank you for, I should e'en hae set the goose, and the wild dukes, and the runlet of sack, to balance that account. Goodwill, man, is a geezen tub that hods in nae liquor; but good deeds like the cask, tight, round, and sound, that will hod liquor for the king." "Have ye no heard of our letter," said the mother-in-law, "making our John the Queen's cooper for certain, and scarce a chield that had ever hammered girt upon tub but was applying for it?" "Have I heard?" said Caleb, who now found how the wind set, with an accent of exceeding contempt at the doubt expressed. "Have I heard, quoth she?" And as he spoke, he changed his shambling, skulking, dodging pace into a manly and authoritative step, readjusted his cocked hat, and suffered his brow to emerge from under it in all the pride of aristocracy, like the sun from behind a cloud. "To be sure, he canna but hae heard," said the good woman. "Ay, to be sure, it's impossible but I should," said Caleb, "and say I'll be the first to kiss you, Joe, and wish you, cooper, much joy of your preferment, naething doubting but ye ken wha are your friends, and have helped you, and can help you. I thought it right to look a wee strange upon it at first," added Caleb, "just to see if ye were made of the right metal. But ye ring true, lad, ye ring true." So saying, with a most lordly air, he kissed the women, and abandoned his hand with an air of serene patronage to the hearty shake of Mr. Girder's horn-hard palm. Upon this complete, and to Caleb most satisfactory information, he did not, it may readily be believed, hesitate to accept an invitation to a solemn feast, to which were invited not only all the notables of the village, but even his ancient antagonist, Mr. Dingwall himself. At this festivity he was, of course, the most welcome and most honoured guest, and so well did he ply the company with stories of what he could do with his master with the Lord Keeper with the council, and the council with the king, that before the company dismissed, which was indeed rather at an early hour than a late one, every man of note in the village was ascending to the top gallant of some ideal preferment by the ladder of ropes which Caleb had presented to their imagination. Nay, the cunning butler regained in that moment not only all the influence he possessed formerly over the villagers, when the baronial family which he served were at their proudest, but acquired even an accession of importance. The writer, the very attorney himself, such is the thirst of preferment, felt the force of the attraction, and taking an opportunity to draw Caleb into a corner, spoke with affectionate regret of the declining health of the sheriff clerk of the county. "An excellent man, a most valuable man, Mr. Caleb, but that's all I say. We are poor feckless bodies, here the day, and awa by cock screech the morn, and if he fails, there maun be somebody in his place; and if that ye could airt it my way, I shall be thankful, man. A glove stuffed wi' gowd nobles, and hark ye, man, something canny till yoursell, and the Wolf's Hope carols to settle kindly with the Master of Ravenswood, that is, Lord Ravenswood, God bless his lordship." A smile and a hearty squeeze by the hand was the suitable answer to this overture, and Caleb made his escape from the jovial party, in order to avoid committing himself by any special promises. "The Lord be good to me," said Caleb, when he found himself in the open air, and at liberty to give vent to the self-exultation with which he was, as it were, distended. "Did ever ony man see sic a set of green gaislands? The very pickmaws and solangees out by yonder at the Bass hae 10 times their sense. God, an I had been the Lord High Commissioner to the Estates of Parliament, they couldn't hae beflummed me mair; and to speak heaven's truth, I could hardly hae beflummed them better neither. But the writer, mercy on me, that I should live in my auld days to gie the ganag by to the very writer. Sheriff Clark!
but I hae an auld account to settle with the carle, and to make amends for bygains, the office shall just cost him as much time serving and tide serving as if he were to get it in good earnest, of whilk there is sma' appearance, unless the master learns mair the ways of this world, whilk it is muckle to be doubted that he never will do. End of chapter 25.